The aliens, who are tall and white and have family groups with women and children, would frequently come down to where I was.
Forget everything you think you know about UFO sightings. Charles Hall didn't just see aliens. He worked near them, learned their routines, and earned their trust.
When I first encountered the aliens, I was terrified because they're not human, even though they look reasonably human.
His time with the tall whites wasn't brief. It stretched over years inside one of the most secretive places on Earth, Area 51. Join us as we unpack his story, the science behind it, and the question nobody wants to ask. What if he's telling the truth? Man who made aliens laugh. Charles Hall wasn't abducted. He didn't have a one-time encounter. Instead, he spent years, day in, day out, working alongside something very few can claim to have seen, non-human beings. While stationed as a weather observer for the U.S. Air Force in the mid-1960s, Hall was assigned to the remote Indian Springs gunnery ranges in Nevada. That's where everything changed. Out in the quiet desert, far from city lights and distractions, Hall began noticing strange movements. At first, he thought he was just seeing things. Tall, pale figures glowing in the distance, but it didn't stop. Over time, those figures started getting closer. They watched him, tested him. Then something rare happened. They made contact. These were not the typical little gray men described in headlines. Hall called them the tall whites, an intelligent, highly advanced species that seemed both cautious and curious. Unlike most reports, Hall's experience wasn't terrifying or brief. It was slow, strange, and deeply personal.
When you see an alien scout craft intentionally blocking the road, making sure that I didn't go any further.
He learned their behaviors. He saw their families. He even shared moments of awkward humor. In one case, he said, he made one of them laugh, truly laugh, just like a person would. Hall's story is not about fear or fantasy. It's about the long, quiet process of building trust with something unknown. His background in nuclear physics gave him the tools to interpret what he was seeing, not just emotionally, but scientifically. Whatever your view on aliens, Charles Hall's account stands out because of one thing: time. He didn't run. He stayed. First contact in the desert. When Charles Hall first saw strange lights moving in the desert, he thought it was just his eyes playing tricks. The shapes were tall, glowing, and always at a distance, too far to see clearly, but too odd to ignore. Other weather observers at the Indian Springs Range had their own stories. One of the strangest was the tale of Range 4 Harry, a ghostly white horse said to glow in the dark and float silently across the desert floor. At first, it sounded like a local myth, something soldiers passed around to mess with the new guy. But the sightings kept happening. Hall started seeing the same pale figures again and again. They weren't ghosts, and they weren't just passing by. Over time, the patterns became clear. These beings, tall, white-skinned, and oddly graceful, weren't just curious. They were observing him. They would appear suddenly, disappear just as fast, and react to his behavior. If he panicked, they backed off. If he stayed calm, they moved closer. Hall realized he was being studied, not in a lab, but in real time. The desert had become a kind of proving ground, and his reactions seemed to matter. The line between legend and reality blurred. What started as stories of haunted ranges and glowing horses soon turned into something far more serious, an introduction to a species that had been here long before he arrived. And for some reason, they had chosen to make their presence known, specifically to him. First, bonds formed. Charles Hall wasn't the first person sent out to that isolated desert range, but he was one of the only ones who stayed. Others had seen strange figures and left shaken or silent. Some refused to return. One even ended up in the hospital. But Hall reacted differently. Instead of running, he paid attention. He stayed calm. He kept doing his job, even when the tall whites, tall, pale beings with human-like forms, started showing up regularly. At first, they kept their distance. They'd appear quietly, then vanish. But as time passed, something changed. They came closer. They started testing boundaries, and slowly something rare happened. Trust began to build. Hall began to see patterns. He noticed that they traveled in family groups, parents with children, elders nearby. These weren't just visitors. They had a way of life. He saw their behavior up close, sometimes cautious, sometimes playful. He even developed a bond with one of the adults, whom he compared to a brother. This wasn't a quick encounter or a strange dream. It was a steady, years-long experience that involved direct interaction with another intelligent species. They let him see parts of their world, underground structures, flying craft, and social customs. He wasn't invited in as an equal, but they did let him stay near. Hall's relationship with the tall whites didn't come from authority or training. It came from patience. In a place where most would panic or shut down, he listened. That made all the difference. Underground bases and craft. The craft themselves were nothing like human planes or helicopters. Hall said they were smooth, with no visible seams, windows, or sharp angles. Some were shaped like oversized tic-tacs, others like rounded eggs. At night, they glowed white and hovered silently. They could rise straight up, shift direction instantly, and, based on what Hall observed, travel far beyond the speed of light. He noted that their movement didn't rely on traditional engines or fuel. The technology seemed built around controlling fields, possibly force fields, that let the craft float, maneuver, and disappear into the sky with no sound. These weren't one-off sightings either. He saw the same types of vehicles again and again, and he believed they came and went on a schedule, much like cargo flights or transport runs. For Hall, the advanced craft were just one part of a bigger picture, one that suggested long-term presence, not just visits. The desert wasn't empty. Something had already moved in. The tall white woman's test. One of the most unusual events Charles Hall witnessed wasn't about flying ships or strange technology. It was about blending in. According to Hall, the tall whites wanted to learn how to move unnoticed among humans. They were advanced in many ways, but socially they struggled. Their behavior, expressions, and even how they walked often came off as stiff or unnatural. So, they tried something bold, a field test. A tall white woman who had spent time around humans was chosen for the task. Her goal? Dress and act like a regular American woman and walk toward Hall in public without using any advanced tools or protective force fields. Hall's role was simple: pretend to be her husband, just for this test. What made it more intense was the audience. According to Hall, dozens of tall whites watched from a distance, hidden but observing. This wasn't just for curiosity, it was a cultural test. Could one of their own pass as human under pressure? She tried. But as she got closer, her nerves showed. Her body language changed, and before reaching Hall, she panicked and turned back. The experiment had failed, but it wasn't seen as a loss. Over time, they kept refining. Hall says the goal wasn't deception, it was comfort. The tall whites weren't trying to fool people. They just wanted to better understand how to exist among us, quietly, carefully, and without fear. Even advanced beings, it seems, can be shy when stepping into unfamiliar shoes. The Greys and the Norwegians. Over the years, he came to understand that there were other non-human groups also operating in the area, each with their own look, technology, and purpose. The first were the Greys, small, thin, with large heads and dark eyes. These are the same types often described in UFO reports and linked to the Roswell incident. Hall said they were more numerous than the tall whites and used different, slightly less advanced craft. He believed they came from a closer star system and had been on Earth even longer. Their presence felt colder, more distant. They didn't engage the same way the tall whites did, and they rarely interacted with humans directly. Then there were the Norwegians with 24 teeth, as Hall called them. These beings looked much more like us, tall, human-like, and able to pass unnoticed in public settings. They seemed more relaxed and careful in how they approached contact. Hall described them as patient and diplomatic, less strict than the tall whites, and possibly more comfortable with human emotion. What surprised Hall most wasn't just that different groups were here, it was that they seemed to share the same territory, quietly coexisting in and around the same desert zones. Each had its own role, its own style of contact, and possibly its own long-standing reason for being here. To him, Earth wasn't being visited, it was being managed by more than one group. The Hall photon theory. Charles Hall wasn't just a weather tech, he had a strong background in physics, and after years of watching craft move in ways that defied everything he'd been taught, he started asking questions mainstream science couldn't answer. One key moment came when he noticed these alien ships moving so quickly and smoothly, they had to be going faster than light. But according to Einstein's theory of relativity, that's not supposed to be possible. So, Hall started from scratch. He used what he observed in the desert, craft blinking across miles in seconds, force fields behaving in strange ways, and built his own theory around it. He called it the Hall photon theory. The core idea is simple. Light isn't just made of two fields, like electricity and magnetism. Instead, it may contain many more force fields we haven't discovered yet. Some of these could allow energy to move much faster, especially if they interact with matter differently than what we currently understand. In Hall's view, the speed of light isn't the hard limit we think it is, it's just the speed limit of the fields we know about. The tall whites and other species, he believes, have figured out how to tap into these unknown forces to travel across space efficiently. This theory isn't based on guesswork, it's built on direct observation, watching how advanced craft actually behave in real environments. Whether it rewrites physics or not, it pushes us to consider that we might still be missing something big inside the alien craft. Charles Hall's descriptions of alien craft don't sound like science fiction. They sound practical, more like mobile homes in space than sleek Hollywood saucers. According to Hall, these ships weren't just for flying, they were built for living. The larger craft, especially the deep space ones, were big enough to house full crews and families. Some were shaped like smooth eggs, others like rounded trains. Inside, they had what you'd expect in any long-distance vehicle: seats, control stations, storage, and even restrooms. Hall says it clearly: these beings eat, sleep, and yes, they use bathrooms too. He also observed different sizes of craft for different jobs. There were large ships meant for travel between star systems and smaller scout vehicles for short trips on Earth. Some seemed designed just for the younger ones, like a school bus in the sky. These smaller ships were simpler, but still highly advanced. The flight suits the beings wore were just as important. They weren't just clothing. They were full systems that allowed the wearer to float above the ground, move silently, and even group together in formations. When powered up, these suits gave off force fields and sometimes even radiation strong enough to cause real harm if you got too close. Everything Hall witnessed seemed built with purpose, not for show, but for safety, speed, and comfort. Whether they were traveling across the desert or across light years, these ships were more than craft. They were fully equipped vehicles made for everyday use. Military collusion or alien embassy? Most people think Area 51 was built to hide secret aircraft, but according to Charles Hall, it may have been placed where it is for a different reason, because something was already there. Hall explains that parts of the Nevada test range, like Indian Springs and areas called Dreamland, weren't just empty desert. These were zones where non-human groups were already active. Instead of removing them, the military set up shop around them. In Hall's view, these sites worked more like embassies, neutral ground where humans and aliens operated side by side, with limited contact and strict rules. He describes how only a few high-ranking officials, were even allowed to know about the presence of these beings. Lower-level personnel were often left in the dark. In some cases, if someone saw something unusual, like glowing figures or strange craft, they were told to stay quiet or face reassignment. Hall himself was never formally briefed or debriefed. That was on purpose. The beings he worked around could sense human thoughts, so the less people knew officially, the safer it was for everyone involved. Hall's take is that the relationship wasn't open or equal. The non-human groups operated independently with their own goals. The military allowed them access, possibly in exchange for limited cooperation or knowledge, but the rules were strict, and the risks, especially if anyone crossed a line, were real. This wasn't about secrecy for secrecy's sake. It was about containment, managing something the government couldn't fully control: high-speed horse formation. Out in the desert, Charles Hall witnessed something that sounded like legend, but turned out to be real. Locals talked about a glowing, ghost-like horse called Range 4 Harry that roamed the test ranges at night. For a while, Hall thought it was just a spooky story passed around the base. But one night he saw it for himself, and it wasn't a horse at all. According to Hall, the tall whites had a way of grouping together in a very specific formation. Imagine a few adult beings, a handful of children, all wearing powered suits that let them float above the ground. When they moved in sync, 2 adults in front, kids in the middle, and 2 more in back, their glowing suits merged into one bright shape. From far away, it looked like a huge white horse flying silently across the desert at incredible speed. Hall called this the high-speed horse formation. It wasn't a myth. It was a travel method. The suits allowed the group to move quickly, up to 100 miles per hour, floating just above the sand. From a distance, the glowing light and heat gave off the impression of something alive and otherworldly. This is where local stories about Range 4 Harry began. But Hall's explanation was rooted in first-hand observation. It wasn't a ghost. It was a coordinated group of advanced beings, using their technology in a way that just happened to look like a glowing horse galloping through the night. Ice Age origins and desert farms. Charles Hall came to believe that the tall whites and the grays weren't recent visitors. According to him, they've been here since the last Ice Age, not just passing through, but living, working, and quietly building in some of the most remote parts of the American Southwest. One of the clearest signs, he says, lies in the desert valleys, areas that look empty at first, but show signs of ancient use. Hall described L-shaped valleys with dry lake beds and natural amphitheaters, ideal for farming during wetter periods thousands of years ago. He claimed that in one such valley, he saw what looked like massive man-made tunnels cut into the mountainsides, 13 in total, including one large enough for a ship to enter. These weren't just caves. He believed they were once used to store grain and other supplies, possibly grown right there in the valley when the climate was wetter and more stable during the Ice Age. To him, this was clear evidence that the Greys had been growing food, storing it, and maybe even trading it long before modern history began. Hall also pointed out the strategic layout of these areas: narrow entrances, wide open fields, and perfect visibility, ideal for defense and survival in a wild landscape. And according to him, the tall whites arrived later, building on what was already there. In Hall's view, the desert isn't just a testing ground. It's long been a quiet hub of off-world activity, hiding ancient stories in plain sight. Faster than light. Charles Hall spent enough time in the Nevada desert to see patterns. One of the strangest involved the timing of alien arrivals. In one case, a group of tall whites left Earth and returned just a few weeks later, saying they had gone to a star system nearly 36 light-years away. This raised a serious question. How could they come back so quickly if Einstein's theory said nothing can travel faster than light? Hall watched these craft closely. He saw them take off, stop suddenly in mid-air, shift direction instantly, and even vanish on the spot. not gradually, immediately. They didn't slow down or glide, they simply blinked out, then reappeared somewhere else. To Hall, these weren't illusions. These were real, physical objects moving in ways that broke every rule of conventional physics. He believed their technology worked by controlling force fields, ones we don't fully understand yet. These fields didn't just push or pull, they bent space around the craft in ways that made speed and distance behave differently. That's how a trip to a faraway star could take days, not centuries. According to Hall, this wasn't about fantasy or imagination. It was about real observations, repeated over time, in controlled areas. What he saw suggested that the speed of light isn't the ceiling we once thought. It might just be the speed limit we are stuck with, for now. The craft didn't break physics. They followed a different version of it, one we haven't caught up with yet. How to build a UFO. Charles Hall didn't just watch alien craft fly, he paid close attention to how they were built. Over time, he noticed key patterns in their design, especially in the ones built for long-distance travel. First, he explained that shape matters. The ships he saw were smooth, no sharp corners, no flat edges. Most were shaped like rounded eggs or stretched ovals. This wasn't just for looks. Hall believed that when moving faster than light, sharp angles can disrupt force fields, causing turbulence that could overheat or even destroy the craft. Inside the ship, the systems were equally advanced. He described something like ceramic fiber optics, cables made from heat-resistant materials, possibly similar to melted rock. These fibers didn't just carry signals, they carried particles, tiny building blocks of energy that powered the craft's fields and systems. Some ships could even repair themselves while in flight. Hall observed that the outer layers of these crafts weren't just armor. They were active parts of the system, built to manage heat, pressure, and even radiation. If a section got damaged, it could adjust or reroute energy without needing to land. Deep space ships also had beacon systems, used not for communication, but to call for help if anything went wrong during high-speed travel. According to Hall, even with advanced tech, safety was still a concern. Hall's ride in a craft. Charles Hall didn't just see the ships. He says he actually rode in one, twice. According to Hall, the experience wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. In fact, it felt strangely normal. The craft didn't shake, rumble, or make loud noises. It simply lifted off the ground and moved through the air like the room around him was floating. No gravity shifts, no sudden movements, just a steady glide, quiet and calm. The reason for the ride was medical. Hall had injured his knee, and the tall whites offered to take him to their base to check if he needed treatment. He sat in the cargo area of the ship, surrounded by both human officials and tall white personnel. There were no seat belts, no control panels in sight, just a clean, open space. The ship moved low over the valley and entered through a large door hidden in the desert hills. The tall whites believed they had used electronic hypnosis on Hall. They thought he would forget the trip, or at least not remember the details clearly. But because of his pain and exhaustion, the hypnosis didn't fully work. Hall stayed aware the entire time. He recalled everything, how the ship moved, how it sounded, and how the atmosphere inside felt. His ride wasn't about thrills, it was about access, an inside look at how these beings traveled. For Hall, it was proof that these ships weren't beyond understanding. They were real, built for purpose, and meant to be used by them, and maybe someday by us. Why they chose him. Charles Hall always wondered why he, out of so many others, was the one who could handle years of close contact with non-human beings without breaking down, panicking, or walking away. The answer came years later from an unexpected source, a psychiatrist who had worked with the CIA. According to this doctor, Hall wasn't just mentally tough, he was something rare. In psychology, there are known patterns the mind uses to protect itself under stress. These are called defense mechanisms, and most people rely on just one or two, maybe three, during a crisis. When the psychiatrist evaluated Hall, he saw something different. In just 15 minutes of conversation, he counted over 70 distinct defense responses out of the 105 known to science. That was unheard of. The doctor told Hall that, in his opinion, this ability made him almost immune to psychological collapse under pressure. Where others might panic, Hall's mind adjusted quickly. He could stay calm, reset, and keep functioning, no matter how strange things got. This helped explain why dozens of men before him had been sent to the desert and came back shaken or silent. But Hall didn't just survive the experience, he adapted to it. He didn't force himself to accept what he saw. He simply stayed open, cautious, and observant. And that made all the difference. To the beings watching him, that mental stability likely signaled something important. This one can handle it. And so the contact continued. The Tim Taylor connection. Among the many people drawn to Charles Hall's story, one stood out: Timothy Taylor. He wasn't a UFO chaser or a curious civilian. Taylor was a NASA-linked engineer, deeply involved in space missions, launch systems, and high-level research. But he wasn't just interested in rockets. He had a quiet obsession with people who claimed contact with non-human beings. Over the years, Taylor developed a close connection with Hall. He visited Hall's home, asked questions that most others wouldn't even know to ask, and brought other scientists along with him. They never spoke directly about classified projects, but it was clear Taylor was part of something far bigger than what he let on. What makes Taylor even more unusual is his background beyond NASA. He reportedly had access to materials connected to crash retrieval programs and had deep ties to the Vatican. In fact, he eventually converted to Catholicism after a visit to the Vatican archives, something even his closest contacts found surprising. And then, just as suddenly as he arrived, Taylor disappeared. No warnings, no goodbyes, just silence. Hall and others who knew him never heard from him again. Emails went unanswered. Phone numbers stopped working. Some believe Taylor was part of a hidden network, people who manage not just information, but timelines, technology, and global reactions to non-human contact. Others think he simply stepped away for personal reasons. Whatever the truth is, his link to Hall and his sudden vanishing only adds to the larger mystery. Government ordered to stay silent. You'd think that after years of contact with non-human beings, Charles Hall would have been constantly questioned by military or intelligence officials. But surprisingly, he says that never happened. No formal briefings, no debriefings, not even a written report. At first, that seems strange, until you understand why. According to Hall, the tall whites had an ability that changed everything. They could read human thoughts, not in a dramatic science fiction way, but in a quiet, focused sense. They didn't need words to know what you were thinking, and that made even casual conversations dangerous. If Hall had been officially debriefed, asked direct questions about the tall white's families, habits, or technology, his mind would have carried those questions forward, and the tall whites could have picked up on that. Even a simple question like, how do they raise their young, could be seen as invasive, or worse, disrespectful. To avoid any chance of conflict, the Air Force gave Hall special orders. No one could question him. If someone wanted to check on him, they had to do it informally, usually just observing from a distance or meeting him briefly at the mess hall. He was never to discuss what he saw in any official setting. This wasn't about hiding things from the public. It was about preventing misunderstandings that could lead to serious consequences. In this case, silence wasn't secrecy. It was a safety measure, both for Hall and everyone else on the range. What do the tall whites actually want? After years of quiet contact, Charles Hall came to a clear conclusion. The tall whites aren't here to invade. They're not trying to control Earth or its people. According to Hall, their reasons for being here are far more practical and surprisingly relatable. He described Earth as a kind of cosmic rest stop, Our solar system sits in a vast empty stretch of space, far from other stars. For interstellar travelers, it's the perfect place to pause, refuel, rest, and make repairs before continuing across the galaxy. Hall said the tall whites use Earth the way we'd use a service station on a long road trip. They need clean water, fresh food, and a place to check their equipment. But there's one more reason they stop here. They don't want to be alone. Even though they live much longer than we do, the tall whites still form emotional bonds. Hall shared a special connection with one in particular, Range 4 Harry. Over time, their relationship grew into something close to friendship, but that kind of bond comes with limits. From the tall white's point of view, human lives are incredibly short. Someone they trust today may be gone tomorrow. So while some of them grow attached, they also keep their distance. Does Hall miss them? In a quiet way, yes. The memories are still with him, but even if the tall whites never return, their presence left a mark, not just on the land, but on the life of someone who was willing to listen. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. More content coming your way. See you next time.